For over 25 years, Steve Blum has been Universal Creative's top authority on any matters relating to engineering and safety. On Steve's watch, Universal has opened Universal's Islands of Adventure, Universal Studios Japan, Universal Studios Singapore, Volcano Bay, the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, and countless additional attractions and upgrades and enhancements for these parks and their parks in Florida and Hollywood. Within the Universal vendor community, Steve is widely known and respected as the final arbiter of any matters relating to Universal standards and requirements. Please welcome Universal Creative's Senior Vice President, Engineering and Safety, Steve Blum.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm almost afraid to say this now after one of the earlier presentations, but in case you didn't notice, I'm a baby boomer. The word safety has been there throughout my life, but the concepts and methods associated with safety and how we get to safety, what safety is, when it's good enough, have evolved significantly. It's a testament to technology that we can shoot for a target as nebulous and ethereal as safety, and hit it with such diverse systems as airplanes and spacecraft, infant toys, and lawnmowers. In 2019, there's quite a lot of process, methodology, and logic associated with safety. And this is a talk about safety and the themed entertainment business. But I'm not going to talk very much about the technical terms and methods used in safety system design and validation. We engineers love to embrace this stuff, but if you happen to be here for that, you're going to be disappointed. Instead, I thought it might be interesting to explore indicators of safety's evolution and current status. My thought is that this developing landscape might give us some clues as to what might happen next and what moving forward would look like. So my self-selected targets are up on the wall. Before we start, let's establish a couple of ground rules. Number one, let's assume that we, and this means all of us, don't want to hurt or kill anyone. That's easy. Number two, let's assume that we want to achieve goal number one while conducting business and being able to be competitive. So regardless of what one thinks about safety, it's uniformly agreed that safety does affect business. And the pure business side of safety can be readily related to cost. This figure says that there are costs that come with the consequences of being unsafe, and those might be fines or loss of business or lawsuits, and costs to make things safer. These might be extra systems, loss of efficiency, modernization costs, extra personnel, etc. The safer something becomes, the more risk cost is avoided and the more mitigation cost is realized. And these opposing cost-benefit effects result in and suggest a minimum net cost bucket, which is that optimum safety level that you see on the wall above me. If we were only making pure business decisions, we would target that cost minimum and be done with safety. It's much harder to define and understand the ethics and public reactions to safety. Were I smart enough to distill that into a nice graphic, this could be the end of my presentation. So no such luck. Here are some examples from the automotive industry where business cost-benefit analyses ran aground of public reaction and ethics. I'd guess that both Ford and GM had reasoning behind these safety decisions that could be logically explained. I mean, all of us who have AD&D insurance know that there are specified dollar values associated with body parts and human life. But as you can see, the press and the public saw this starkly differently. So before we take on the ethics of safety, let's realize that the safety landscape is a lot like the 3 laws of thermodynamics, which you may not be familiar with, so I'll give you a quick brief. 1, no matter how hard you try, it's not possible to make it perfect. Number 2, you will therefore lose some of the time. And number 3, life itself is a hazard. So we begin with a serious challenge that we have to get our heads around and put behind us. And that challenge is, regardless of how safe something is, it can be made safer, ad infinitum. Therefore, we must decide where to stop. This is an uncomfortable but undeniable fact, and it means that there has to be an ethical boundary somewhere. In essence, for this industry, where we expose several billion participants a year to our activities, we have to decide how many of those billions we're willing to risk hurting. Yeah, that's not something most people even want to think about. So how does one do this? Well, fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, we provide voluntary recreational activities. Therefore, the customers themselves do a lot to establish acceptable thresholds by their sheer participation. If the customer base considers us not safe enough, they stop participating. At least that's the theory. Thus, maybe we can balance the business logic from the prior slide with measured customer expectations in the safety arena. And customer expectations are a familiar concept. So let's explore whether customers tell us where the divide between acceptable and unacceptable is. So I apologize, but I'm going to use exclusively fatality data in the early part of this presentation. It's not to be morbid. It's because this data is more readily available than injury data, and it's very, very clear what the severity of outcome is when we're talking about fatalities. So let's consider airline travel, which is another mostly voluntary activity for which there's lots of data. In 2014, which was a higher than average year for airline travel accidents, there were 37 million flights and about 3.3 billion passengers. And in that year, there were about 1,000 fatalities. Now, most of the time, you hear about airline safety per million passenger miles traveled. And that's a valid statistic, but I looked at it differently. Because you don't agree to this risk per mile. You agree to it per trip that you take. So if I look at things this way, then we must consider that 95% of the air traveling public takes between 2 and 12 trips per year. And this then calculates out to a risk that something really unsafe will happen to them of about 1 in 20,000. And the public seems willing to take this risk because they seem willing to travel by air. Okay, so let's test this statement. Recently, the Boeing 737 MAX 8 has been in the news quite a bit. Looking at the data for this aircraft type, the risk is about 1 in 1,200 for an infrequent MAX 8 traveler, nearly 17 times more risk than the general air traveler. As the public reactions align with significant public refusal to participate in this voluntary activity, in this example, the public is consistent and reacted appropriately. I was a little surprised here. I was looking for public overreaction fueled by media coverage, and I just didn't find it. Okay, so let's look at cars, another mostly voluntary form of travel. I've long believed what one hears in the media, that I'm orders of magnitude safer in an airplane than in a car. So 2009 was an average year. In the US, there were 220 million vehicles in service, 212 million licensed drivers, 35,000 fatalities on American roads, spread over 660 million trips taken. Again, there's a lot out there in safety per million vehicle miles traveled, but like airplanes, you assume the full risk of a trip once you decide to take the trip. No one says, it's New Year's Eve, I really should only drive 600 yards tonight. Tomorrow I'll take that 100-mile trip and have the same level of risk. You just decide whether you're going to get in the car or not. So that's the way I'm looking at the data. 95% of car travelers take between 10 and 30 trips per week. So the annual risk is about 1 in 10,000 for an average automotive traveler in the US, and wow, their risk is remarkably similar to the air travel results. Another big surprise for me. So back to air travel for a minute. Over time, there has been a consistent reduction in air travel risk and a corresponding increase in the number of trips taken. So perhaps there's a relationship between the safety of this business and the level of voluntary participation. Another way to look at this same data is that the apparent risk willingness of the air traveling public is a moving target and getting more demanding with time. Solely for the sake of giving you a complete picture, here's a look at air travel rates on the left and the distribution of air travel accidents on the right. The statistics I gave earlier are spread across all of air travel, but one can see that the risk the air traveling public takes is less in the fully developed systems and greater in those that are a little bit more immature. However, for the majority of travelers, the general observations I've made remain valid. Similarly, for automotive travel, the numbers I gave change if, for example, I only consider drivers between 16 and 20 years of age, making the statistical risk willingness of the rest of the auto traveling population a little more conservative. That said, if you look at this chart, it suggests surprising fact number 3. It seems, despite popular thought, that it is remarkably safer to travel by car in today's crowds of high-speed traffic than it was when there were very few cars on the road. And the auto traveling public has a similar growth in participation and increased demand for safety that I mentioned for air travel. Okay, so those are 2 cases where we end up with relatively consistent and rational public responses to a safety issue. Let's examine some other safety relatable areas and the public reaction. Coffee. So there are legends of this hot drink dating back to the 9th century AD and pretty clear historical evidence from the 15th century. So for 500 years, coffee was coffee. And then in 1994, this happened. And in this suit, McDonald's admitted that several hundred people had been injured and that customers didn't know that they would be burned to a level consistent with the actual risk. In this case, I'm not going to show you the statistics, but let's look at the corporate and public reaction. Coffee, as well as tea and other hot beverages, were forever changed. And between 1994 and the present day, there's been a veritable explosion of warning signs and labels. Here in California, these especially proliferate. Warnings and instructions requiring adult supervision are now highly common in activities as well as in products, and this has changed quite a bit over my lifetime. Moving to playgrounds, those regularly seen in towns and cities across America in the early to mid 20th century are unrecognizable in comparison with their late century counterparts. I had thought this was advancing design to be cool and colorful, but that was mostly untrue. Some versions of these older equipment types are still on the landscape. Seesaws, for example, are now rarely seen and only exist in versions that cannot hit the ground, feature pivoting hubs with fluidic dampers that limit velocity, and sport big fairings shielding all pinch points and entrapment locations. There's a story that gives some insight as to why this national playground transformation happened. The story begins with a single tragic playground accident in Chicago, leading to a landmark lawsuit that, for the time, resulted in a very large settlement. Then the relatively new Consumer Product Safety Commission issued recommendations for playgrounds, and over the next decade or so, playgrounds across the US were transformed. Many activity types disappear, elevations are reduced, identified risks are eliminated, and playground rules are dramatically expanded and posted. Other countries followed suit. In 1996, strict playground safety standards were adopted in Australia. Interestingly, the initial accident rate improvement is short-lived, and rates return to the same increasing trend seen historically. So what's going on? Well, this is a combination of behavioral effects that give rise to interesting fact number 4. The public's behavior and their apparent risk willingness do not align when risk reduction affects an activity in ways that are disagreeable to the participants in that activity. Before we move on, from this slide, we see that in Australia, the risk level calculates out to about 1 in 850 for playground fall-related serious injuries. Let's remember that for later. Okay, many effects were happening simultaneously here. We were culturally drifting into helicopter parenting, so playgrounds were always supervised in a way unknown in the earlier century. At the same time, early playground transformations were frankly boring, so attendance by other than toddlers initially plummeted. In time, enterprising kids ignored posted signs and engaged the equipment in ways more interesting to them. This customer base was voting for a reduction in safety. It was their parents pushing the other way, and much more so than their ancestors. I mention this as it evidences at least one key element affecting us now and in our future. So let's talk a little more about these adults and the children who are our customers today and where their attitudes come from. While the public responded rationally to the reality of air travel and car safety, this is not the case for all things that people relate to their personal safety. Take violent crime in the United States, for example. There are statistics that show that crime of essentially every type is dropping precipitously. All violent crimes fit into the statistic, but most news speaks about the number of crimes. And in some cases, these raw numbers are rising. But per capita, which is a statistic that actually measures your chance of being involved in a crime, the opposite is true. Public perception misaligns badly with this factual reality. In fact, the perceptual gap is even worse than it looks up there. In all but 3 of the 22 years I'm showing, more than 50% of the population believe that crime had increased year on year. In fact, precisely the opposite is true. Violent crime has dropped in all but 3 of those same 22 years, to the tune of a 75% rate reduction over that time period. Of course, the public is delivered raw numbers, which do rise, as I mentioned before, in some cities for some types of crime. So the public's perception is not completely irrational if that's what really matters. But isn't this supposed to be a measurement of perceived risk to the individual? I think so. And with that assumption, many will be shocked by the real trends in violent crime versus their perception. By the way, this has nothing to do with whether we should be happy with the rates, 1 in 13 at the beginning of this period and 1 in 50 at the end. But we might want to be more aware that the rates are significantly improving. Lastly, our society tends to seek the negative to find improvement, and the press is often an agent in that endeavor. And that's another important point for us, of course, which I'll touch on again later. Jumping to another societal concern, missing persons tells a similar story. This slide shows the number of missing persons reported and advertises that there's been a 40% drop. If you actually correct this for population growth, it's more like 50% over the time period. But more significantly, the public perception of this problem is hugely overblown. Perhaps we could call this the milk carton effect. In reality, statistically speaking, for any one child in the US, one author estimates that one would have to leave that child outside unattended for 750,000 years to develop a high statistical likelihood of abduction. The actual mathematical probability is about 1 in just over 14 million. Regardless, if you recall the prior chart, it seems those helicopter parents should really keep their kids entirely off the playgrounds and just leave them standing out in the front yard, where the risk is apparently 16,470 times less. In the last several decades, we've become more worried about our kids than ever. But kids are, in reality, far less likely to have any kind of danger result in a real problem than ever before. So public perception relatable to safety is sometimes pretty accurate, cars and airplanes, and sometimes pretty skewed. And a point to make here is that these are the vast majority of our guests, because the adults that we're dealing with today grew up in this environment that I've been describing. So what about everything else? Well, earlier we focused on some statistics for voluntary and other activities. To put things in proper perspective, when one considers all of the things that result in people dying, the examples I used are very small contributors. Road accidents come in causal at 2.76% of all fatalities. Violent crime, 0.71%. Everything else that I have and will talk about individually is less than 0.01%, including the whole entertainment industry. Obviously, we'll talk more about that later. One last point to make about where we are. In my lifetime, the landscape has grown in both directions. More safety and more varied, risky activities. 30 years ago, Evel Knievel was considered to be several cards short of a full deck. This kind of daredevil stunt is now completely routine. This and so many other extreme sports and adventure activities ratchet the risk side of the equation up significantly. In contrast, 30 years ago, no one wore helmets on ski slopes or bicycles. Now, no one doesn't. It's been more like 60 for baseball and football, but the trend in sports to enable risk via safety equipment is well established. This type of conservative practice adopted into societal fabric both reduces risk and adjusts the public perceptions for safety. Today, we're socialized to safety from birth. A hospital will not give you your infant unless you both have and demonstrate proficiency in using an infant car seat. So one of our first life experiences is to be strapped into a piece of safety equipment. Very different from when I was born. Okay, so what are some other effects at play in safety as we move forward? Well, timelines got a lot shorter. Sorry. Both new tech phenomena and tragedy go global in hours. So in our world, the newest of offerings are rapidly out there being experienced by many. While it is common for the inventors of this new tech to think about safety, statistically rare nuances can be missed and become a primary focus when dealing with hundreds of thousands or millions of exposures. If you think about it, automotive safety developed over a century, and for the first few decades, the exposure levels were very low. The inflatables and wingsuits in this image came on the scene and spiked in numbers in far less than a single decade. And that activity on the upper left has been on the scene even less time. And now you know about it. Some of you may try it, and a percentage of those will post it, proliferating it additionally. Moving away from safety for a minute, the same rapid spread of product and information has caused the consumer to be much more sophisticated, much more rapidly than in the past. In the modern moment, the entire well-developed market knows what near authentic experiences are in near real time. Immersive 3D stereoscopic imagery rooted in the 1950s held the audience's interest for nearly 60 years. While still an important theatrical tool, immersive in 2019 is more likely to be nascent tech, such as high-definition VR with haptics. Okay, we've touched on how we feel about safety, where it comes from, is it rational, what are our customers' safety and other expectations, and large-scale real-time adoption of emergent tech. So let's remind ourselves of several key points. Most adults in our parks today grew up in the 80s and 90s. The children in our parks have largely been raised within arguably overprotective societal norms. We shouldn't be surprised that they are at the same time inclined to have a higher safety expectation and a lower ability to use self-preservation instincts. We should also not be surprised with the trend to seek higher risk activities in a more protected population, especially among the younger audience, as myriad studies show that this is fundamental to the human maturation process. Lastly, we should not be surprised that the societal training from infancy that someone other than self will shield one from harm results in what many believe is a greater propensity for irrational litigation. Simultaneously, medical and public safety technologies have answered the mail to a large degree. This helps feed a broad expectation that all experiences are available to all people. And we also feed that expectation by inviting them all. I'm not suggesting that this is a bad thing, only that the often cited failure to heed warning signs or failure to understand their own physical health limitations is an unsurprising outcome to these mechanisms. You may note that I haven't once mentioned a government agency or a regulatory body, and that's because the population's attitude leads regulation. It doesn't lag regulation. So that's the landscape. For us, being in the business of trying to be the shiny object, the must-have experience, the compelling escape from reality, means we're always ready to change in dramatic ways while holding on to the heartfelt guest experiences our audiences grew up with. We grandfather old tech, we early adopt new tech, and we enable its rapid proliferation. We feed the need for risk and excitement, or at least the need to feel as if there's risk. We have Pepper's Ghost effects and roller coasters that have been around long enough to engender a deep understanding of their use cases and safety akin to automotive and air travel. But we also have VR and zip lining that have grown explosively in the last couple of years. Even evolution is dramatic for us. It's remarkable to me how many new ways we have spiked thrill higher and higher, and we are significantly compelled to invent, to innovate, to push the envelope, and we really, really do. I'd wager that the average park guest in 1955 would pass out if any of the 3 more recent images were actually offered to them as an experience. Yet here they are, and they entertain tens of thousands per day. We do this remarkably well if you buy my idea that the sheer attendance numbers we post suggest the public, for the moment at least, is mostly okay with the average risk level that they take by participating in our activities. This slide is about injury types that rise to the level of needing something beyond first aid. We're the red arrow all the way to the right. It says that a typical day at one of our facilities is one of the safest things that you can do with your recreational time. Sometimes the media might make it seem otherwise, and we have certainly seen our share of tragedies, but the numbers are the numbers. Regarding the media, there's a lot of public interest in us. And you, of course, know much of this interest peaks negatively when there's any press-worthy accident. And as with most bad news, stories that sell can skew towards sensationalism. So the worst accidents get the most coverage, and the data and statistics in these is always normalized in ways to accentuate the negative. What's clear is that regardless of how safe we might be, an expectation for better arises each and every time a media-worthy incident occurs. So the public generally expects a visible reaction and that will make whatever happened less likely. And there's nothing to indicate that the customer is going to change in that regard. So one expectation going forward is that this goal line is going to continue to move away from us. If you want to stand on the apparently stellar record from the prior chart, you're going to do so at the peril of your business. On that point, IAPA says the risk of any serious injury per ride taken for all ride types in a fixed-site U.S. park is about 1 in 18 million. Remember, the risk for air and automotive was between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 20,000, so we're clearly held to a different standard. We can grouse about this, and we do. We say there should be no media coverage, no legislation, no public outcry, but we all know perception is reality. And like violent crime, we can be judged by the raw numbers rather than the more rational statistical likelihood. And there may be value in public interest prompting industry to focus on understanding and embracing countermeasures to any tragedy. Moreover, to a very great degree, we are bringing ourselves, our friends, our families to our and each other's facilities. So there's a lot of personal and peer pressure to at least try to do the right thing. Ethics aside, it's also well understood that a serious incident hurts the industry and puts the business future of the subject facility at immediate risk, regardless of any regulatory penalties. Guests vote with their feet, and nearly 50% say they would not go or would stop going to an attraction or facility with a recent serious incident. There are many examples of entire operations bankrupted by a single bad accident. So given these pressures to have good safety, if we are perceived to and do fail on rare occasions, what are the mechanisms? Well, I'll give you 3. First, the circumstances of accidents often suggest that a better understanding of the true risk level ahead of the tragedy is needed. Missing this leads to a failure to raise our safety IQ to align with system complexity prior to a mishap causing a serious incident. Second, normalization of deviation. This is the same effect that underpinned the Challenger disaster of several decades ago. This is slow, progressive seduction arising from small, individually inconsequential changes in risk. And since they don't raise risk much, after a time, we think of them as normal. But they accumulate until we get past a tipping point, and the now much higher overall risk results in a disaster. Lastly, even in the most sophisticated of our operations, there's a likelihood that groups of people charged with safety, charged with avoiding the previous 2 effects, are at risk of following a recognized technical or safety expert like a group of lemmings. Organizationally, this is intolerance to a single point of failure, no matter how expert the single point may be. So I think that we have to be as quick to understand the risk and hazard mitigation techniques as we are quick to develop and field remarkable and exciting innovations. Okay. I said I wouldn't devolve into the minutiae of how safety professionals do this, but it is worth mentioning that safety control endeavors are increasingly well understood and standardized, including the parts where we illuminate what is good enough and how we decided. These methods can help to counter the inadequate safety IQ effect, and they also yield records that can be re-examined and defended later on, and counter the normalization of deviation and follow the expert effects if one embraces an organizational safety culture that reinforces habitual return to the original hazard analyses to make any safety-related decision or change. Well, this is well understood from a technical point of view. I didn't say that it was easy. In a world where we're better than 1 in 10 million for serious injury risk, we are deep into diminishing returns. However, at IAPA's estimated 1.8 billion rides given in 2017, we're talking about hundreds of serious injuries per year at those very low incident rates. And that's been a public perception issue regardless of the statistical argument. So we cannot declare a victory, as the public's willingness to participate in our activity defines our goals. Innovative experiences, wonder, excitement, thrill, and extreme safety together is what our customer wants and what it takes to remain relevant and in business. The themed entertainment business has a long history excelling in these pursuits. But the landscape is changing rapidly, and information is more abundant and real-time than ever, yet the opportunity to deliver unparalleled experiences has never been greater, and the tools to understand audience safety demands and react to them are there and advancing every day. Our challenge remains, as it always has been, to synthesize, to systems engineer, and to harmonize everything about diametrically opposed pursuits. And to do this more quickly and under a more watchful and critical public eye than ever. This is our game and our home field, and playing is the rush we're all addicted to. So I see the safety part of this as just another chance to innovate. Just another technical challenge that must be overcome to deliver the desired guest experience. And therefore, I expect more crazy, more shocking, more beautiful, more immersive, and more safety at the same time. Thank you for having me, and I hope this talk prompted some thoughts in you.
Steve Blum, everyone, thank you.